I would now like to ask First Officer Ellen Brinks and her panelists to please make their way to the stage. We are very fortunate to have with us this afternoon a panel of medical experts whose vocation is to help aviators obtain and maintain their medical certification. Here to moderate this panel is ALPA's Aeromedical Chair, First Officer Ellen Brinks. Ellen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have to follow up a great speech from Chair Hamady, so thank you for attending. We'll start out with introducing, there is a bio in the app, so I don't want to get into too many details here with everything, but my name is Ellen Brinks. I am an A330 pilot for Delta Airlines and the National Aeromedical Chairman. With us today, we have our Meet the Doctors panel, and we have Deputy Federal Air Surgeon Brett Wyrick, Dr. Brett Wyrick. Unfortunately, Dr. Susan Northrup, the Federal Air Surgeon, could not attend today. She had a conflict in her schedule. And then we have our Dr. Quay Snyder, who represents the Aviation Medical Advisory Service, or AMAS, and our ALPA Aeromedical office. So with that being said, this is always a very engaging panel. We will leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience or from the app. So I'd like to dive right in. And I know we're probably sick of talking about COVID because I think it's been the last 2-3 years, I feel. It feels like an eternity. But what I'd like to discuss is the latest data shows that we've got about 60% of the population has had COVID at some point in the time in the last few years. So Dr. Wyrick, could you speak to how many pilots or the percentage of pilots that are reporting or that they've had COVID, because that is required to be reported on your 8500? And then how is that process going? Are they grounded if you have it, or could you speak to that a little bit, or what would be a grounding reason?
First of all, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I am here representing Dr. Susan Northrup, the Federal Air Surgeon, and she sends her regrets that she couldn't be here in person today due to competing factors. Not that there's anybody more important than you guys, but sometimes when it comes to budgets and things like that, Senate staff takes priority there, so thank you. And our approach, in the first place, Dr. Northrup and I both share a common interest. We're both pilots. We like to fly, and we both dislike going to see our AMEs. We actually, we hate the, personally, I hate the whole thing. You go in and you see your AME, and you go through the whole routine, and then, they put the stethoscope on your back and everything like that, and then they say, and it's like, what does that mean? And it's like, so we've both got a love of flying, and so we appreciate some of the stresses that the entire system puts on you guys. And from the very beginning, I came from the Air Force. Then I joined the FAA, and I was a Northwest Regional Mountain Flight Surgeon over in Seattle. And of course, Dr. Northrup was Senior Regional Flight Surgeon. Then we both got promoted up here to Washington, D.C., and I dare say that we brought a more operational perspective to the Office of Aerospace Medicine over the past 3 years. And when I say operational, Susan and I both share the same vision. We believe that we should put pilots in the cockpits where they can do their jobs. That's what we're all about. And we feel that if somebody falls victim to injury or illness, it's our job to get them back into the cockpit as soon as it is safe to do so. And that's our philosophy going in there, and that's the way we approach it. So when COVID came around, we got a lot of advice from experts and things like that about, okay, we're going to have a new file, we're going to have new coding, we're going to have different, we're going to treat this differently than we've done everything else. And Susan and I were able to say, nope, we're not doing it any different than we're doing for any other viral disease. And so we don't care if they've had COVID, we don't care if they've had Ebola, we don't care if they've had whatever it is that they've got. We don't see this as being unique. What's unique is, does it cause certain symptoms, syndromes, or other complications that will prevent somebody from doing their job adequately in the cockpit? And that's what we're going to look like. So the fact that somebody has had COVID really doesn't really doesn't matter to us. It's what has been the sequelae of it. Have they had the pericarditis, and if they've had pericarditis, are they recovered from it? Have they had pneumonia? If they've had pneumonia, are they recovered from it? So that's how we've pretty much been taking it ever since the beginning of it. And as far as the percentage of pilots that have had COVID, we see the same numbers throughout the pilot population as we see in the general aviation population. And as far as the severity, in our older pilot population, we see some of the more severe complications as we've seen in the general population. In the younger pilots, we don't see as many complications from the COVID that we've seen. And I hope that answers it. Did I come close to answering the question?
Yeah, absolutely,
All right.
absolutely. So just one follow-up question to that. And so if you've had no symptoms, but you did go and you took a PCR test, came back positive, didn't even have to see your physician, should you report that you've had that then?
Yes, I mean, yes, report it, and we'll look at it, and and your AME will ask about it and say, hospitalization, no. Any sequelae, no. Fine, fly,
Okay.
do well.
Awesome. That's what we all want to hear, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, Quay, with that being said, if somebody does get grounded by the FAA, how would your office help a pilot who has had any long-term symptoms or ongoing signs, anything of that nature? So if there was a hospitalization, and what would you do?
Well, we certainly would advise the pilot to do what is ever best for his or her health first, when that's the primary importance. The FAA had or still has a very clear protocol that I think it makes very logical sense about continuing to fly when symptoms are resolved, the reporting requirements, but not flying after a severe hospitalization or with long-term complications, hospitalizations involving an ICU or with pneumonia. And in those situations, we assist the pilots in collecting the appropriate medical records, the documentation that's required by the FAA protocol for those reports to take to his or her AME and review them to make sure that it meets all of the requirements, but also to look at it from a health perspective. If a pilot wants to go back to flying, but he or she is complaining about a brain fog, well, then we need to inject some reality here, that we're a safety organization and we're also about health. So let's make sure that that is resolved, and we've documented that so that when the pilot truly is ready to return to fly, they can do so. And the FAA has all the appropriate documentation to assure them that they would meet standards and be able to perform safely and effectively.
Excellent, excellent. Well, on that note, this is a perfect segue, because the silver lining to the pandemic is we're talking about mental health now, mental health within aviation. And one of the things that was just announced by the FAA was the newest CACI. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, CACI is a condition an AME can issue for. And it was brought out, the situational depression for adjustment disorder with minor depression and minor depression in general was issued. This was just issued originally in May, I believe, of 2022. So could you explain what this CACI specifically means for pilots, Dr. Wyrick?
Yes, and thank you for the question. And the origin of the CACI is, and both Quinn and I are Air Force flight surgeons from way back when, and when it used to be that there's certain things that you just don't talk about around the squadron, and everybody maintains an even strain and you can handle it. And anybody that is outside of the norm there, anybody who deviates from that, weak, okay? That's not the case, all right? And after so many years of combat experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places, we take a look at this and we look across the general population. And one of the things that we notice is that at some point in your life, most people will be subject to situational depression, mood disorder, however they're categorizing it, of some sort or another. And we're taking the approach, and we've got lots of scientific evidence that supports this. Just because you've been depressed once doesn't mean that you're crippled for the rest of your life. For instance, if you break your arm or if you break your leg, we put it in a cast, we treat it, and then once you're healed, you're ready to go back out. You're ready to go back out again and resume your duties. Why do we treat mental health any differently? Somebody's been depressed, they've been treated, they've recovered, there's no further issues on it, then it's time for them to get back in the cockpit and start flying again. And that's how and the other thing is we want people to feel like they can be treated, that they can fess up when they're having problems. I can't imagine having a disease where if I admit that I've got this disease, I'm going to lose my livelihood and I'm not going to be able to support my family. That's terrible. That's not what we're about, and that's not where we want to go to. What we want to do is when people have a problem, they can fess up, they can say, I've got this problem, they can get the treatment that they need, and then when they're better, they can get back to flying. And that's why we did the CACI. The mental health processes that we had in the FAA are involved. They can be cumbersome, they can be burdensome, and we looked at that and we said, is it really accomplishing a mission of safety? And can we get to the safety mission just as easily by decreasing the burden on the airmen, encouraging them to get the treatment that they need, and also developing more of a partnership and a conversation that will allow us to look at deeper issues of behavioral health and mental illness.
No, that's wonderful. I think this is a huge step forward. Like to dovetail off of or to follow up with that, I guess what I would ask is now, do you foresee any other mental health diagnoses being issued under the CACI, or is there going to be a follow-up to that so that there's a wider range of treatment for pilots to feel comfortable going and seeking that treatment?
One of the things that we're looking at right now, in fact, we were looking at this yesterday, is the CACI program. We think that the CACI program is probably one of the more successful things that we've done over the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. And we're always looking for conditions that would be amenable to CACI authorization. And at this point, we're getting kind of towards the end of the CACI pool of diseases and diagnoses that we can draw from. Mm-hmm. All right, but I think that we are just now beginning to scratch the surface of what we can do with behavioral health and mental illness, because before the answer was just flat out no. And now we go back and we look at some of the advances in therapeutics that are out there, some of the techniques that are out there, and we also look at some of the medications that are out there right now. And we're thinking, there's probably some ways that we can expand how we treat behavioral health and mental issues in the FAA. And we've recently hired a pharmacist to advise us on new medications that are coming forward. We're beefing up our psychiatric staff to the maximum extent possible. We're hiring every good psychiatrist that we can find right now and trying to get through some of these log jams that are taking months and months and months to get to a decision. And a lot of times it's and then the other thing is, all right, and Dr. Northrop and I both do the same thing. Okay, so when I first came into the office, they bring me a stack of charts, and there's come in on a Monday morning, there's 5 stacks of charts there, and I say, what is this? And they said, these are the pilots that aren't going to fly anymore because they've got these conditions, and we need you to sign them and ground them. And I'm saying, okay. And I started looking through the first chart, and I said, this is only half the answer. This tells them that they can't fly. I need the other half to say, what does it take to get them back into the cockpit? Please go back and start again. And so that's how we approach it, and that's what we're looking at with the mental health also. Is all right. We've got part of the answer. Now, what does it take to get them back in there, and how do we do this? And can we do this internally without taking the time to send this back to the Mayo Clinic and several specialists and then try and get all the paperwork back in and do that? Can we do it in-house? And that's why we're beefing up our psychiatry staff right now.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So to follow up, have you had any concerns from the AMEs? Like, are AMEs willing to issue that CACI, or has there been any pushback from AMEs? Because there has been a shrinking amount of AMEs that are even available just due to retirements, and they closed their doors during COVID, unfortunately. So
that's a great point. A lot of our AMEs during COVID were older, and they said, I just can't afford to practice like this anymore. And we did lose a significant number of them. We've got some significant recruiting efforts right now, trying to find the right physicians who have an interest in aviation medicine and that right philosophy of how to, aviation is a life. I mean, if you didn't, what Chairman Hamady was saying there, aviation is the lifeblood of our economy, and the United States used to be a maritime nation. Now we're maritime and an aviation nation. If we're not strong in aviation, we're not strong, we're going to fail as a nation. So we need to find AMEs that have that perception, get it across to them, and have the same philosophy that we do, that we're trying to get people into the cockpit. So that's one. And we've got several recruiting issues out there that I can elaborate on later. But the other thing is, when we look at the CACI program, the last thing we want to do is push an aviation medical examiner into making a decision that they're not comfortable with. And we find that some of them will say, it's been years since I've done renal failure. I don't feel confident issuing with this, and we encourage them to go ahead and defer in that case. There's some of them that say, I'm really uncomfortable with a mental health diagnosis, and I just don't even want to touch that. You know what, doctor, that's fine. Give it to us, we'll look at it. But then at our aviation medical examiner seminars, we try to educate them as much as possible. Here's the things that you need to look at. we don't try to teach them psychiatry 101, but we do try to teach them aviation psychiatry 101. Here's the things that would really prick up your ears. These are the things that you need to pay attention to. And here's how you go ahead and work with this CACI. So there is an education involved there, but there are a number of, like I said, there's a number of AMEs that aren't real comfortable with it. And if they're not comfortable with it, we don't push them on there.
Okay. All right, that's great. Now, Quay, to follow up with that then, so your team of doctors does not directly refer pilots to a psychologist or psychiatrist. You don't have
Correct.
the insurance to make those types of referrals. So how does your team help a pilot figure out what's the best course of action for them? What would you recommend?
ALPA has developed a team of aviation-savvy mental health professionals, approximately 50 plus professionals that would be great resources for those individuals to go to. And some of them can practice via telemedicine, which geographically, pilots have some limitations getting to that, to aviation-savvy providers. But let me just back up for a second. The Pilot Fitness Arc in 2015, following German Wings, made several recommendations, and they recognized that there were barriers and stigma that precluded pilots from seeking mental health help. So as part of that, the effort was to remove the barriers, but also, as Brett said, to educate the AMEs. And I believe it's 3 hours of additional training in mental health that the AMEs are getting in their recurrent training, which is required every 3 years. So that will help the AMEs so they aren't uncomfortable issuing the certificate. The other thing is we encourage pilots to establish a long-term relationship with an AME so that AME is familiar with them and avoids the discomfort that Brett was referring to there. Particularly if a pilot goes to a new AME and he or she isn't known to that AME, the AME is less likely to issue the certificate. So establishing a long-term relationship with a competent one. And then the SSRI program requires that the AME be HIMSS trained. And just yesterday we finished the HIMSS conference and we trained approximately 50 AMEs, of which about 30 were new ones. So they'll come into the fold and have the level of expertise, diligence. They've performed well. They've been identified by the FAA as being high performers, and now they have the education so they can get involved in it. I think the one area where we still need some work is the pilot. You've given me this card here, right?
There it is, exactly,
yeah,
yes.
The pilot's assistance card, about functioning well, stressed, distressed, and diseased. And it's those pilots in the stressed area who are probably still safe to fly, but could potentially benefit from treatment. The peer support program is wonderful, and that can take care of a substantial majority of those people in the distressed area. But there are some people who would benefit from the counseling and having clarity about continuing in counseling, not on medication, and continuing to fly with the understanding and the open discussion with the AME that would happen. So I think that's where we are right now. The physicians are just getting used to the CACI, and there's some questions about the physicians about whether they really can do this, although it's fairly clear that they can, but I think that will evolve over time to something that will work more efficiently.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
And if I could just go back to COVID for 1 second, I need to.
We were done talking about that.
Oh, okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
We talked about it for the last 2 years.
I just need to praise the Federal Air Surgeon's Office. You know, for the first time in history, a non-FDA approved vaccine came out, and the FAA, which has never allowed someone to use a non-FDA approved pharmaceutical or device, said, in the interest of the safety of our pilots, we'll allow this vaccination to take place, but we're not going to require it, so no pilot is required to have it. But if the pilot wants to take the vaccine, they can after a 48-hour observation period, which really led the way worldwide for that. And that was a discussion of collaboration with the pharmacists and everything, and I think it worked out wonderfully for the safety of the traveling public and for our pilots in particular.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
kudos to the FAA for doing that in a collaborative and scientific fashion.
Thank you, Quay, and we greatly appreciate all the input that your group gave us and all the other experts who made that decision. And in retrospect, it was the right decision to make. We still feel it's the right decision to make, and in the future, it'll lay the groundwork for next time we have a pandemic. So it was a.
Fingers crossed, we
Yeah.
don't.
Well,
Yeah.
history says we will. It's just, yeah.
We will, it's just when.
Hopefully not in our lifetime, though.
Right, no. Well, so here's a follow-up. We've discussed the CACI, but let's say that a pilot is grounded for a mental health diagnosis. So with that being said, some of our carriers, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, some of them have a disability limit of only 2 years. And the majority of all of our carriers have a 2-year limit to mental health diagnoses under disability. There's only one carrier that has basically a lifetime coverage for mental health illness, or up until their age 65 when they retire. So what is there, and one of the biggest complaints that I get is that it takes too long to process the SSRI applications. So could you talk about what the actual process is for that application? And I know that, for instance, a pilot has to be stabilized on a dosage of medication for at least 6 months. So right there, we've eaten up 6 months of time. And if they have to change the dosage to meet the needs that they have, then that restarts the clock. So what happens after they're actually stabilized on the dosage and the paperwork goes into the FAA's office?
And again, that is one of the things that we're looking at right now with trying to remove the bottlenecks in the certification and the special issuance process. And one of the questions that we've asked as recently as 2 weeks ago is, why do we have a 6-week wait, and why do we only have 4 SSRIs now that are over 20 years old when there's other things out there on the market? And why does it take so long to get from point A to point B? And one of the reasons was we just didn't have the manpower, hence the reason why we're adding so many more psychiatrists and trying to beef up. The other thing is we used to insist that we had a mental health review panel, and after we went back and reviewed a couple hundred cases of what they had done, we said, all right, so everybody made the same recommendation. Why did we have to have the panel? So recently we have removed the recommendations for the mental health panel, and we've empowered our individual psychiatrists to make the decisions that they were going to make anyway. And that's going to have a significant effect on how it's going to do it. The other thing that we're looking for is how to remove the bottlenecks. And one of the problems that we're dealing with right now is our information systems and how we collect electronic medical records from digitalized images, digitalized reports from other electronic medical health records, get them into the system so that we don't have to send a paper copy by the U.S. Postal Service down to Oklahoma City and then have them scanned in by hand, one by one, when most medical record systems can talk to one another and they can already sort and file it the way that we want. So and this week one of the things that we got was we got approval authorization and we've obligated the money for a digital imaging software system that is going to allow us to, before we used to have to have hard copies of x-rays. So what would happen was you'd bring in a disc from your radiologist, it would go to your AME. Your AME would then download these into hard copies, send them into Oklahoma City, and then they would scan them back into a digital copy that our system could read. And we're trying to eliminate all those steps. So that's what we're doing as far as the process goes. And our goal is to get these things turned around within 60 days. That's where we're trying to get to. And we've got certain specific targets that we're going to reach over the next year. But that is the goal. Turn them around in 60 days and don't keep people hanging.
Well, that's amazing. I would love to see that because I know exactly.
And I might add that to a certain extent, although it will be a different system, the HIMSS process is working that way. The FAA has instituted a system called Huddle where we can electronically transfer records and they're reviewed directly at headquarters. And we're seeing quicker turnaround times because of the ability to transmit digital records.
So will that be the goal? Is the 60-day window going to be the gold standard for all special issuances then? Wow.
60 days, that's our goal. That's where we're trying to get to.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And not only that, it's not just 60 days, it's also keeping the pilot informed of where the airmen informed of where their system is in the record. And if you guys have been on MedExpress recently, you've noticed that there's some additional information that we give out as to where you're at in the queue. Do we have everything that we need? Do you need to do any other action? And how do we get? How long can you expect your wait to be? Part of the problem that we've had over the last 3 years is almost 3 years now, has been with the COVID, and we've lost our regional flight surgeons' offices have been working so hard to keep the air traffic control organization up and functioning, that we've lost about 25% of our overall aeromedical certification capability. So now as we're coming out of the pandemic, or at least this phase of the pandemic, we're trying to bring those guys back online and get them doing more certifications. The other thing is that as we look at where we're going to in the future, we've done some other things. Anybody that's gotten a letter from us recently, we're doing them differently than what we were, and that comes from the fact that one night, Saturday night, midnight, I'm going through an airman's file and I'm reading our letter that I'm about to sign, and I can't figure out what it says for all the legalese that's in there. And I said,
I can't either.
you got to be kidding me. So I sent this back with Dr. Northrup's permission. I sent this back to committee, and I said, we need to have some letters that are readable, that are understandable, and say up front, this is what we're looking for from the airmen. This is what we want, and here is your responsibility. Because we used to start off the letters with the Federal Air Surgeon has determined that you are not qualified under CFR 1467. However, and you got to read down to the middle of the page after all the legalese to get there. And so we started saying, hey, put it up front. Congratulations, you're going to fly again. But here's what you got to do in order to keep this going. And we think that's a much more sane and reasonable approach to do it. The other thing one of the things that we discovered shortly after Susan and I arrived in Washington, Dr. Northrup and I arrived in Washington, was that when the letters were coming out from the Civil Aeromedical Institute down in Oklahoma City, AMCD, and they would say, okay, here's the things that you need to do, and then you need to submit this file, this test, this report, this consultation. And then when things were missing, they would send the same letter. And I said, how is the airman supposed to know what was there and what wasn't there? And I said, that's unacceptable. And Dr. Northrup agreed and said, and so from now on, or actually it's been this way for several months now, if we send you a letter and said, we require this information, we'll exit off or we'll say, this is what we've got and here's what we still need. And so that way you can focus your attention, because part of the thing was people didn't have any idea. They're trying desperately to get their aeromedical certificate back, and they're just gunning volumes and volumes of medical records are there. And now we're trying to sort out what is it that we were looking for in the first place. So we're trying to get beyond that. Those are some of the things that we're trying to do right now.
So I feel like we can expect as a group of pilots a friendlier, more streamlined FAA. Is that what you're saying?
I would say we've always been friendly, but I'd say, it's I'd say there's more of an emphasis, especially if you listen to our administrator and also listen to the Secretary of Transportation. I mean, now it's not. Our job isn't to keep pilots from airplanes. That's not our function. Our function is to facilitate. Thank you. Our job is to facilitate the lifeblood of our economy, which is aviation, and that's what we're trying to do.
I would also add that there's a tremendous education effort out there. If you watch Dr. Northrup's The Pilot Minute that she puts out every month, there's instructions to pilots about maintaining your medical certificate, a host of things. And there's also a similar AME Minute that comes out instructing AMEs on current topics. And you can subscribe to it. It's 1 minute, maybe a minute and a half at most, but it's very, very informative. And I would encourage all of our pilots to sign up for that and have their AME sign up for it as well.
Yeah, and one of the other things I'd like to say is Dr. Northrup has this concept of omnidirectional communication. And the other thing is that we're federal servants and we're being paid by the American taxpayer to do what we do. And there should be nothing secret about it. Your medical records, of course, are private. But our processes, what we're using, what our references are, where we're going to find our information from, and how it works should be an open book test. And we found that one of the things is we've got different certification manuals for the regions, for the AMEs, for the headquarters, for appeals. And right now I'm combining this all into one guide, which will be publicly accessible, and every airman, applicant, air traffic controller is going to be able to look it up and say, if you have X condition, say it's a occlusion of the left cardiac artery, then what is it, left anterior descending artery, what is it that we're going to be looking for, how will we base our decision on, and what can you expect? And I think that just getting the information out there, getting over ourselves a little bit, and demystifying the whole process is what's required and what's deserved for you, the American taxpayers, and that's what we're working on.
That's great. No, we appreciate that. So this question affects any of our military pilots that have served our country, or currently serving or formerly served, but anyone also that was out on disability. So a few years ago, the VA started releasing records of service to the FAA. There was a crosstalk communication. And Dr. Weyer, could you speak on the process of determining whether or not a pilot who had received disability from the VA and inadvertently omitted reporting that on the 8500, your Aeromedical report, what steps a pilot should follow when they get a letter in the mail from the FAA seeking more information or a failure to report, and then follow up with some of the consequences they face from the Department of Justice or the Department of Transportation?
So this is something that we have been dealing with for several years, and recently we had another push from the Department of Justice and the Veterans Administration saying, here's the number of people that we believe are not reporting their disability to the Federal Aviation Administration. So the first thing I'd like to say is the fact that anybody's receiving a VA disability is not in of itself disqualifying. And you guys got to get that message out for us, okay? Especially to your brothers and sisters who are still in the military, the fact that they're receiving a VA disability has nothing to do with whether or not they can fly an airplane. Even if they're 100% disabled, it depends on what they're 100% disabled for. And the other thing is the VA disabilities vary remarkably very remarkably from institution to institution, region to region to region, and things that the VA would give somebody 100% disability for may or may not be aeromedically significant. So the first thing that I'd like to say to everybody is, you know, the fact that you're receiving a VA disability does not mean you're unqualified to hold a medical certificate. It has nothing to do with it. What we are interested is, what is your diagnosis, and does that impair your ability to fly an aircraft? That's what we're interested in. That being said, I've spent some time in the VA system, and knowing how that system works, when this all came out, one of the things that we looked at was, is the information we're receiving from the VA accurate? And you know, we are still wrestling with, because there are so many variables that go into a VA disability decision. And what we found is that we've got this list that DOJ says you got to act on this and you got to do this because these guys are maybe committing fraud. And we say, all right, so let's go back and look at this, and we ask the VA for the actual records. And what we found is, you know, some people, yes, they're receiving a VA disability, but some of them got their VA disability letter after they filled out their 8500 and went to apply for their medical certificate, okay? So why are that's not fraud, that's delaying the VA processing. So we look at, that's one of the factors that we're looking at. And then there's some of these, you know, they've already been reported. And for instance, we had one helicopter pilot who lost his leg in Iraq back in 2008, and above the knee amputation, and he presented to us for a SOTA, you know, statement of demonstrated disability, and we did a flight test on him, passed him off, and everything like that. So we knew about the injury, and his point was, well, you know, you already knew about this. I told you about this. Why are you sending me this letter now? So there's a lot of variability here, there's a lot of discussion to have, and we're still trying to sort through it. The one thing I will say again is, if we ask for information, send it to us, and send us complete information as quickly as you can. And if you lawyer up and clam up, I can't help you. Then it goes into a different level of attorney-client privilege, and you got FAA lawyers talking to private lawyers, and there's very little that I can do for you at that point. So the big thing is, if you think you've got a story and it's a reasonable story, tell us. I'll listen.
That's great. That's what we'd like to hear. So with that being said, then, with what you just said, would that be your recommendation for correcting a previous failure to report, or would you add to that, or would you give a checklist? We're very good with checklists. So what would be our checklist for doing this?
First thing is, am I receiving a compensation from the VA? Okay? If you're receiving compensation from the VA, why are you receiving compensation from the VA? If it's for a disability, start checking that on your box now, all right? And, you know, I didn't know it, I didn't know it. Whatever your reason was, start checking that box now and putting it down in there. And the other thing is, give us a call and tell us what happened there. You know, send us a letter and let's have the conversation. That would be my recommendation. Okay,
that's great. So for all of our Canadian members out there, I failed to mention this at the beginning, but Transport Canada was not able to send a Dr. Brooks to attend the conference this year. But Quay, one thing that I'd like to talk to you about, as of January 1 this year, the ALPA Aeromedical office started offering services to our ALPA Canada members. So could you explain what types of service you're currently able to provide to a Canadian member, and what type of services you'd like to be able to provide in the future going forward, and what you're looking to help our Canadian members do so that we all are receiving the same level of care?
Sure. I will say we resume services to Canadian members because we provided those services.
That's true.
Up until about 8 years ago, and we've since resumed those. We have a long history of working with the FAA, 53 years. The ALPA Aeromedical office has been working with the Federal Air Surgeon's office, and we've developed a great relationship of trust, of mutual respect, of honesty, and hopefully we make the FAA's job easier by providing complete information. Our goal is when we get a package and we send it to the FAA, we want their physicians and review staff to be able to touch that one time. So it reduces the burden on them. They don't have to send out letters that say we need additional information, conserve their resources, and get our pilots back in the cockpit quickly. We would like to have a similar relationship with Transport Canada. Right now, Transport Canada uses CAMIs in Canada very effectively, and there are 2 CAMIs that do a lion's share of the work. And when I say a lion's share of the work, those are the complex cases that would require submission for the Canadian equivalent of a special issuance certificate. At this point, we don't have that relationship, but we're hoping to develop that. We advise Canadian pilots as to health issues and effects of medication. We ask them to check with their CAMIs about the medications, whether there's a waiting period, et cetera. And if there is a situation that arises, we have Mr. Dave Noble, who's out here, who can coordinate services with 2 of their physicians to get help. And I liaise also directly with those physicians on occasion. The other thing that we're doing is ALPA Canada has a wonderful program called ARC, their equivalent of the HIMSS program, which is in its nascent stages right now. And we've offered any assistance that we can, and their representative, Captain Ian Gracie, spoke at our HIMSS conference 2 days ago and gave a wonderful presentation. So that's another way we'd like to assist the Canadians in providing services. And you know, I went up to Toronto too to talk about peer support. But ultimately, our goal is to develop a relationship with Transport Canada that we have had with the FAA for so long, because we think we can reduce the workload, improve the efficiency, and get pilots back quicker if we could assist them.
That's great. I mean, I think we all have the same goal. We want to be flying airplanes, right?
Safe and healthy first.
Yeah, that too. Absolutely. So with that, Dr. Wyrick, there's a bill that is sitting on the Hill right now. I'm sure most of our pilots are familiar with it, to extend a pilot's retirement age to 67. So hypothetically, if that regulation was to be passed, what will the FAA be looking at from an aeromedical perspective to maintain the level of safety that we're known for within the industry?
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically.
So whenever we have a law passed by Congress, we take a look at it, and it'll go through the various departments at the FAA, and one of them will usually be aviation safety, and say what are the implications, and how do we make a rule respecting this law. So those are the things that we would look at hypothetically if the bill is passed. The things that we're most concerned about is cognitive ability and the ability to fly. You know, when we look at I think they said, you know, it's been said, you know, as you get older, you just slow down. Some people slow down dramatically. Some people don't. I equate it. I'm a surgeon. I was a surgeon before I became a flight surgeon, and you know, in the operating room, we see some elderly surgeons that you know, somewhere in their mid-60s, early 70s, they just shouldn't be operating anymore. They don't have the reflexes. They don't have the eye-hand coordination anymore. Sometimes they don't have the cognitive ability anymore, and that's pretty much true throughout the human experience as people age. But the other thing, the problem is, where is the cutoff line? And there's nothing magical about age 65. It used to be 60. There's nothing magical about age 67. It's really, we'd have to look at the performance of developing performance-based standards of whether or not people can still do their jobs and do them safely.
Right. Well, in Canada, there is no regulated age for them to retire, right? So, and I mean, we've got a few countries around the world that do that.
That is correct. Mm-hmm. That is correct. And those are some of the things that become even more complicated now as you look at some of the aircraft that are coming out, the cockpits of the future, how many things you have to keep track of in the cockpit, the overwhelming information displays that are available to the aircrew on the flight deck, and those are the things that we're looking at. And what I'd say again is, if hypothetically, if something like that was passed, then we would be looking at the performance-based standards to meet the intent of the law.
Well, and the other thing to add to that is that it takes a very self-aware pilot to recognize that we're slowing down. I've flown with some super sharp 64-and-a-half-year-old pilots and some super sharp 40-year-old pilots, and there's that differentiation, disparity there too. So it takes a lot of self-awareness, and nobody really likes to stop flying as far as pilots are concerned. No. So, well, with that being said, we have about 15 minutes left in the panel, and I think I'd like to open it up to the questions to the audience. So that normally there's always quite a few. So if you do have a question for Dr. Wyrick or Dr. Snyder, this would be your time to make your way to the microphone here and ask your questions. And I don't want everybody to jump up at once, and I'll do my best. The lights are really bright, so it's hard to see somebody. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Mahoney. I'm the HIMSS and Aeromedical Chairman for Spirit Airlines. I've got 3 questions, so I'll try to be as quick as I can to respect the time of everyone else. The first question that I'd like to ask is about the coronary heart disease protocols. We face a lot of issues with pilots after they recover from an MI from the 3 and 6 month post-catheterization period. A lot of the interventional cardiologists don't want to do that second cath because they don't see the medical necessity of it. Do you have any insight as to why the FAA requires that, and if you foresee changes on that in the future?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. And I can. One of the things is, in the past, we just didn't have the history. We didn't have a long enough history of cardiac disease and the newer technologies to make a risk decision matrix that would allow us to act on that. And so we had to have more tangible evidence in hand. Now that we've got some of the different imaging modalities that are available to us, and and one of the questions we're asking right now is, how often do we find disease with the second catheterization? And could we have found that disease with a CT angiography, or was there another way to find it? One of the other concerns that I've had as a deputy federal air surgeon is the number of times that we're sending people back to do the nuclear stress scans, and we're concerned about their heart. But if you take somebody annually and give them a nuclear stress test from age 45 on to the end of their career, what is the radiation dose that they're getting? So the short answer to your question is, we are looking at that right now as far as what is necessary, and is it just to make us feel better, or is it really adding to safety? And if it's not adding to safety, we're going to get rid of it.
Great. Thank you. The second question I had, I advocate for a lot of pilots that are HIV positive and in the special issuance process there. I've noticed over time that as you've added more khakis, like for hepatitis C, for example, the requirements after special issuance are fairly similar between hepatitis C and HIV, absent the cognitive testing. If someone's initial special issuance for HIV is considered stable and their cognitive status is unchanged, would the FAA ever consider moving that out of a deferred special issuance and into a khaki category?
If we had adequate evidence, maybe. The question with the HIV positive is so many times when somebody is progressing from their HIV positive status that the initial presentation is mental and cognitive. So one of the things we see as somebody is declining is a sudden increase or actually a sudden decrease in their cognitive abilities. We continue to look at that annually from the standpoint of what is the best treatment, what's the best recommendations out there. I can tell you right now, we're not actively considering a khaki for that, but we constantly take a look. Are we being overly cautious? Are we being too burdensome?
Thank you. My final question, I work with a lot of pilots that are dealing with mental health issues, some of them on SSRIs. there's a lot of stigma and obviously shame associated with certain mental health conditions, and the people that choose to get help and are medicated for that or considering medication with their provider, there's a fear in speaking up about that if they're already on it to disclose it to you guys. Would the FAA ever consider medical amnesty for pilots that decide to report it that are on those medications without disclosing it, in terms of, because I've been aware of certain cases where there has been enforcement action for their non-disclosure of being on that medication. Would the FAA ever consider any type of medical amnesty for pilots that come forward to say, hey, we want you to be well, and kind of encourage that culture of psychological safety and accurate reporting?
I think that's probably a question for the administrator and the enforcement branch of the FAA, and I'd hesitate to speculate on that. The one thing that I can say is, what I've said earlier. We don't believe that mental health and behavioral health issues should be stigmatized. We think it's a part of natural. We think it's a part of natural human process, just like a cold. You have a cold, you get over it. And again, we're looking at all the medications and all the modalities that we can utilize to get pilots back in the cockpit as fast as possible once it's safe to do so. The one thing is with regard to the stigma, that's one thing where all of you in the audience can help us with. Just if you see something, speak up and say, hey, how are you doing, And there just seems to be it's kind of a pilot thing, It's like, I can do it. I can tough through this. The things that make you ready, reliable, and accurate as you are in the cockpit are, when it comes to your own personal health and sometimes your behavioral health needs, are detrimental. And sometimes it does take an acceptance among the community. Just because somebody had a mental health diagnosis at one time doesn't mean that they carry that label through the rest of their lives. I look at it and I say, I would much rather know that I've got a pilot in the cockpit who did suffer from depression, who has been treated for it, and is now maintained and is continually monitored. I'd rather have that than somebody who's trying to white knuckle it and get through it all on their own. But that's something that this community can help us with.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the questions.
That's great. There's somebody walking up. Excellent.
Hello. First of all, I wanted to thank you for moving forward on this issue of mental health. I am Captain Renee O'Shaughnessy, and after 35 years of a satisfying career as an airline pilot, I have retired. Recently, I wrote a book about mental health in aviation and conducted some research, including 100 commercial pilots that have lost their privilege to fly due to addictions. However, they were all protected under the HIMSS program. Here's my question, and I'm curious. If all 100 pilots were protected under the HIMSS program, half of them were back to flying within months, and the other half either lost their license, revoked, or suspension. Could you talk to that? Thank you for your time.
Okay. And thank you for the question. I appreciate it. One of the things that is that the HIMSS program comes with very specific requirements and gates that you have to meet. It's a matter of you have to comply. And we've seen a number of people with addiction problems. They have an initial recovery and they have a relapse, and that's why we go ahead and we monitor them so strictly over the course of the rest of their, in some cases, over the course of the rest of their career. We look at all the data constantly, and is there a way to do it better? And one of the things that we've realized is we don't have enough HIMSS trained AMEs out there, which Quay was helping us address out there in Denver over the weekend. And the other thing is we're trying to get more drug and addiction specialists on staff at headquarters here in Washington, D.C. To deal with these problems and to look at it from a greater, and look at it from an overall more wider perspective. Do we have it too narrow, or do we have it just right? But necessarily, once somebody enters into the HIMSS program, They've got strict requirements, and they have to toe the line. They have to help us out, and they have to help themselves out with the career. And I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it did. Thank you very much for taking my question and addressing the question. One last part to that, though. If they were all confessed under the HIMSS program, why do some get back flying and why do some get their license revoked? Is it just a matter of people pushing through the system? Or?
No, it's a matter of sometimes people don't do what they say they're going
Gotcha.
to do. And sometimes, unfortunately, the addiction has such a hold on their life that they're not able to fulfill the promises that they've made to themselves and to the program. And you know, substance abuse and addiction it is an overwhelming and terrible disease. And while we would strive for a 100% cure rate, you and I both know that doesn't happen. So we do our best, and we continue to do our best with that.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes, ma'am.
And Renee, if I can add to that while our next speaker comes up, the overwhelming majority of pilots are successful in returning to fly. I would say it's probably in excess of 95% of those pilots who present to the HIMSS program through their HIMSS committee at the MEC go back. Our relapse rate is the envy of everyone in the world. Our low relapse rate is the envy of everyone in the world. And the FAA allows pilots, after they've relapsed, to regain their medical certificates. There's no limit on the number of relapses. As Dr. Wyrick said, it's a terrible disease. It's progressive, it's fatal if not treated, and it's prone to relapse. But the support of the HIMSS structure that we have in place right now with peer monitors, company monitors, AMEs, the drug testing or the abstinence testing for drug and alcohol, the reports that are coming in. Me as a HIMSS AME independent medical sponsor, send an affidavit in every 6 months. My mic just went off. Send an affidavit in every 6 months to the FAA about the continued progress of that pilot. And when we see pilots who perhaps are waning a little bit in the quality of their recovery, there are mechanisms we can help them, not only with maintaining their medical certificate, but most importantly, their sobriety, their health, their lives, and that of their family too. And it's a part of a safety program. So we just spent 4 hours this morning talking with our colleagues from the UK and Australia about it. We're going over to Europe because they've mandated a HIMSS program. We're going over there to help them establish what we have here now so successfully we're at 48 years now into the HIMSS program. And it's a wonderful collaboration between the regulator, between the airline, between the union, and the medical professionals.
It is a wonderful program, and thank you very much, Quay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. This will, okay. Oh, never mind. I've been cut off. We had 3 minutes, sorry, I apologize. So we'll talk offline, how about that? So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll be available for anyone to speak with, and Dr. Wyrick might be able to stay for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'll give my best.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone.